Marzio asked me to clarify one thing. He felt bad about his statement that he made about if you're silent, then God is not working. He said that was a joke. He said, I just want you to clarify that for everyone, that was not intended to say anything about the congregation or about God. But it is a good reminder for us that we don't have a lot of times as a church that's kind of responsive. But this was a good opportunity for us to think about how God is working in our lives, because we all know in different ways God is working. And so Marzio just asked that I clarify that, just so there's no confusion within the congregation on that. But I'm excited to be back with you all this week, to be back in the pulpit, to open God's Word with you. Thank you for your prayers over the last 2 weeks as we traveled to the States. And please continue to pray for us and for our church. That's why I've found it important to invite Marzio up here for us to have this time to pray together. That's an important thing for us to do, to seek the Lord in this time. For those that have not been with us, we've been studying through the book of Ecclesiastes. Some of you may even be saying, what is that book? Where is that book? I've never heard of that book. It's a bit of an obscure wisdom literature book written by Solomon. And today we're in chapter 5, verses 8 through chapter 6, verse 9. And so, quite a long passage today, but I think it's important for us to see it all together. I will not read the whole passage. I will read a portion of it out of chapter 5, but I encourage you to spend some time reading this whole passage on your own this week, and we'll look at the passage holistically as we study it together. So, right now I'm going to read Ecclesiastes 5, verses 10 through 20. Ecclesiastes 5, verses 10 through 20. Hear the word of the Lord. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to your owners except to look on? The sleep of the working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. There is a grievous evil which I have seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. Then those riches were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son. Then there was nothing to support him. As he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. He will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hands. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as a man is born, thus he will die. So what is the advantage to him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. Here is what I have seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and to enjoy oneself and all one's labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. For this is his reward. Furthermore, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. Let's pause and pray and ask for the Lord's help now. Lord, as we approach your scriptures, we approach a sensitive topic today in finances, wealth, riches, material things. Lord, help us to understand your scriptures rightly now. Help us to live in submission to you. Help us to rightly order our lives that we may bring glory and honor to your name. For your name's sake we do pray. Amen. So today we approach a topic that churches don't like to talk about a lot. Our money. It's not something we like to bring up very often. It's not something we like to give much attention to. But I wanted to start with a quick reference to Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, Jesus gives a parable starting in verse 16. I wanted to start just because for us, we come to a book like Ecclesiastes and we say, yes, but that's the Old Testament. What does this have to do with this today? Well, I think Jesus addresses this almost exactly as Solomon addresses it in a parable that he gives, starting in verse 16 of Luke 12. And Jesus, he told them a parable saying, the land of a rich man, which was very productive, And he began reasoning to himself, this rich man, saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grains and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. And now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. So is the man who stores up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God. You look at the world today. All around the world, people are seeking just a little more money, just a little better job, just a little more education to bump the pay grade. Not a bad thing in and of itself. Finances and riches can be a tool that God can use. But finances and riches and wealth is a terrible God. I've said this many times before, and I'll say it many times in the future. Understand, our wealth, our riches, is a great servant to be used by God. But it's a terrible God. It's a terrible idol that can compete with God. And so it's important for us to understand this. As Jesus talks about it here in this parable, he says, the man who stores up treasure for himself is not rich toward God. The one who's focused solely on this idea of let's just build bigger barns and that's all we should focus on, he says, and yet you can have all of that and be spiritually bankrupt. You can have all of the riches of the world and be spiritually bankrupt. And so that brings us to our passage for today. I started reading in verse 10. It says, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. And so it's an important piece for us to think about, what does this mean? So today our big idea, if you get nothing else, I want us to understand this. Pursuing riches apart from God is an empty and hopeless pursuit. Pursuing riches apart from God is an empty and hopeless pursuit. And understand, wealth can provide some nice things, some joy even temporarily. There was once a comedian that talked about it. He says, you say money can't buy happiness. And he says, but money can buy lots of fun things that I see people happy doing. And temporarily, that may be true. Temporarily, we may see that. But understand, pursuing riches apart from God ultimately is a temporary joy at best. It's not the ultimate answer that we seek, that we know that we desire in our hearts. And so, with apart from God, that is an empty pursuit. And ultimately, a hopeless pursuit. But with God, just to continue this idea, it can have eternal purpose. That everything we get in regards to talent, our time, our money, it's a gift to be used by God for his glory and his kingdom. And so I hope that we'll see this as we consider this today. I want to remind us as we think about the book of Ecclesiastes. It's been a few weeks since we've looked at it. You've seen a number of things that Solomon has sought to study. He's been studying all of these different aspects of life to see if he can find fulfillment in them apart from God. And so he has two categories. He has a category of life apart from God and life with God. Most of the book is focusing on what does life look like apart from God. And every turn he says it's meaningless. He says, I've pursued pleasure, I've pursued drink, I've pursued wealth, I've pursued stuff, I've pursued laughter, I've pursued everything. And he says, and all of them are meaningless. And he gives direct focus today to our money, our finances, our riches. And he says it's meaningless apart from God. But it's interesting, as you study this book, you only get glimpses behind the curtain, but you have these moments where you see Solomon constantly comes back to this idea, but with God. And it's only brief glimpses where he brings up the gift of God. the blessing of God, where you see him peek behind the curtain and say, but a life with God is different. But the bulk of the book is saying life apart from God is hopeless and empty and meaningless. But a life with God has purpose and value. So today we'll look at 5 observations that Solomon makes about the world. This book is interesting because it's kind of this constant flow of observations that he has about the world. And today we'll look at 5 observations. Governments will fail us. Money will not satisfy us. Only God can give eternal purpose and joy to life. You can have everything and still have nothing. Without God, everyone suffers the same fate. So we'll look at these 5 one by one. Hopefully we won't be here too long. I'm a bit jet-lagged and tired, so usually with that, I'm a little more long-winded, so just pray for me as we approach this passage. So first, governments will fail us. This is in verses 8 and 9. If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. After all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. You read this and you think, that kind of sounds opposite of one another as he talks about it. But I just want to remind us, the beginning of chapter 5, we looked at a few weeks ago, and you see this approach to God, this attitude to God, this way we should approach God humbly. That God is the King of kings and Lord of lords, and he is over all. Then he turns his attention immediately here in verse 8 to oppression. So you have this idea that God can be trusted. He's one we should seek. He's one we should know. And then in verse 8 he says, and yet there's worldly kings, and they're usually not very good. And you may look back through history and we see some glimpses of kings that have been good, that have sought the well-being of the people. But we do not have to look very far throughout our world to realize it's pretty common for rulers to take advantage of their people. Throughout time, throughout history, throughout spaces, we've lived in multiple continents as a family, my family has, and we've seen misuses of the government in all of the places we've lived. But notice what he says. If you see oppression of the poor and denial of justice and righteousness in the province, do not be shocked at the sight. This is Solomon, the king of Israel. This is the man who had the power to be a change maker. And even he realized wickedness prevails more often than we would like to admit in the governmental realms. And I want to start here by just saying, if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves falling into this trap. And the trap is the government can save us. If we just have this, if we just have that, they will be the answer for us. They will be the solution for us. But Solomon here says, don't be deceived. Governments will let you down. Governments will fail you. That doesn't mean that we seek to overthrow governments. The scriptures talk about as much as we're able, we seek to live in submission to the governments that are placed over us. But he says, understand the limits of a government. Understand the limits of that, and that above the government is God that's ruler over all. Do not be shocked at the sight of oppression. And then he gives an explanation of what he means. For one official watches over another official, and there are higher officials over them. He says, because one crooked official, one official that handles himself inappropriately, abuses his power, he has a supervisor. Oftentimes, that supervisor's doing the same thing, and then that supervisor over them is doing the same thing. And Solomon understood, but ultimately it goes all the way to the top. Solomon was the king. He understood that he could help to appoint officials who could appoint officials. And as a ruler, he had the opportunity to do great harm or great good. And he says a statement here that sounds counterintuitive to what he has just said. He says, after all, a king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. What does he mean when he says this? A king who cultivates the field is an advantage to the land. Well, I would say this can be viewed positively and negatively. A king who cares for his people, everyone will benefit from it. who cultivates the land, everyone will celebrate from the crops that come from it. But the king who takes advantage of the people will suffer while he takes advantage of them. And so ultimately, Solomon he had spent time traveling the world to see kingdoms, to see rulers, and everywhere he went, he saw oppression and misuse of power. And he was not free of that as well, as you look at his history, the way he treated people. But it's just a reminder for us when we think about an observation of the world is that governments will fail us. Now, we pray for our government. The scriptures call us to pray for our government. And my prayer is often, Lord, help the government to work for the good of the people. We should pray for that. We should seek God for that. But we also should not be surprised when people live in opposition to God in his ways and they cease to work for the good of the people. And ultimately, that's his first observation. And within that, there's much that a government can feed into wealth economically. And so if we're not careful, we'll find ourselves saying, yes, but we need the government to do this so I can make a little more money. We'll misunderstand our purpose in the world, a government's purpose in the world. And so from here, he gets to his second observation. Money will not satisfy us. And you may be here today and you may be saying, yes, Pastor Nick, but you don't know my situation. I'm not rich. That may be true. But the point of this is not just for the ultra wealthy. It's for the poorest of the poor as well. It's a hard attitude as we approach a passage like this, as we think about it, of how we view money. Because you can be poor and still have a love of money that's really unhealthy and sinful. You can be extremely rich and have a correct understanding of money that God can use it for his glory and his kingdom. And so understand as we approach this isn't just for those that are wealthy. But while we're here, it's important to note, if you have running water, power, if you eat one meal a day, you're richer than a lot of people throughout the world. And so it's important for us to understand when we approach this passage that we in this country have things that many around the world would love to have in regards to just infrastructure, support, wealth. Bratislava is a city of growing wealth. So this is an important passage for us to consider. So money will not satisfy us. Verse 10, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money. Let that sit for a moment. He who loves money will not be satisfied with money. John D. Rockefeller, he is known as one of the richest men ever to live. And yet, when he was asked how much is enough, he would always say a little more. Which million was your favorite? He said, the next one. It's an important thing to recognize. Even the richest people in the world always find themselves saying, yes, but it hasn't satisfied my appetite for more. So if you find yourself saying, yes, but if I just got this promotion or this new job, then all would be better. Doesn't ultimately satisfy the craving of our heart, the eternal craving of our heart. As Solomon himself said, in our hearts, God has placed eternity. And yes, we understand we need money to live. We live in a world that requires money. But let's understand that money rightly, that it serves us rather than us serving it. So, he who loves money will not be satisfied with money, nor he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. Just for our reference, it's helpful to look in 2 Timothy. Let me see if I can find it. Maybe it's 1 Timothy. Yes, 1 Timothy verses 9 and 10. 1 Timothy chapter 6. Jet lag. I'll blame it on that. 1 Timothy 6 verses 9 and 10. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare of many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Notice, we often say money's the root of all kinds of evil. No, it says the love of money. This isn't just an Old Testament idea that Solomon had. This is a New Testament idea that Paul continues. It's the love of money. Is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. So as we think about this passage now, coming back to Ecclesiastes 5. Nor will he who loves abundance with its income. This too is vanity. Over and over again throughout this book, he uses this idea of vanity, of vanities. All is vanity. All is meaningless. What's the point of it all? And here, once again, he now comes to money. And Solomon, if you look at it historically, he's considered one of the richest men ever to live. And he says, I've had it all, and it's not the answer. I had all the money, and I'll tell you it's not the answer. And yes, finances provide some temporary satisfaction, but I was listening to a podcast recently, and an NBA player, DeMar DeRozan, said about finances. He says, people like to think that money takes away all your problems. He says, no, money answers a few questions, but it creates a whole new set of problems. So when we think about this, let's understand this, because notice what he says right after this. When good things increase, those who consume them increase. So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? When good things increase, those who consume them increase. In seminary, I worked on a very wealthy man's property, part-time. And it was interesting how often he had to hire people to take care of all of his stuff. And ultimately, that's the picture you have here. He says, when you have good things, you got to pay more people to take care of those good things. So understand, anything, there's a trade-off when we think about it. Is money serving us, or are we serving money? So what is the advantage to their owners except to look on? The sleep of a working man is pleasant, whether he eats little or much, but the full stomach of the rich man does not allow him to sleep. This is a challenging verse, because ultimately he says, the working man, he gets up, clocks in, clocks out, finishes his workday, goes home, goes to sleep. He says, yet the wealthy man, something entirely different often happens. And understand this isn't the case for everyone. This is wisdom literature where he says generally this is the way that it goes. But I think he's talking about multiple layers and levels of things here. He says, one, the wealthy man oftentimes is not doing manual labor. He said, so he eats and he tries to fill his stomach and he's not satisfied. And then he goes to sleep and has a bit of indigestion. Realizes there's a lack of satisfaction. But then there's also an emotional burden that comes with wealth, where he goes to sleep and he's thinking about, oh, what do I need to do to continue to grow my wealth? The burden of the reality of the situation that they have. And so Solomon here is probably speaking from personal experience. How do I keep the kingdom growing? What do I do to keep the wealth flowing? To the point to where he lost sleep. And then he says, there's a grievous evil, which I have seen under the sun, riches being hoarded by their owner to his hurt. When those riches were lost through a bad investment, and he had fathered a son, then there was nothing to support him. And notice the temporary nature of this. He says, you can have it all, make one or two bad decisions, and it's gone. I'm a big basketball fan, so I'll use a couple of NBA examples. You see all the time, you hear horror stories of NBA players that have made $40, $50, $60 million in their careers. And then they retire and they're bankrupt within 10 years. And ultimately, that's what Solomon's saying here, is he's saying, you can have it all and make a few mistakes and it's all gone and you can't even leave any money to your kids. There was nothing to support the son. And then he says something very important in verses 15 and 16. He says, as he had come naked from his mother's womb, so he will return as he came. Money will not ultimately satisfy eternally. You can't take it with you when you go. There's no pockets on the burial shroud. You can try to hold on to it tight. But ultimately, when that day comes that you breathe your last breath, that money doesn't matter anymore. The stuff you have, the houses you have, the cars you have, they don't ultimately matter anymore. So he says, naked you came into the world, naked you will leave. And he will take nothing from the fruit of his labor that he can carry in his hand. Why do we try to hold on so tight? Why do we try to hold on so tight and say, it's mine? Rather than rightly understanding, even what we have, at best, it's a gift from God that we get to care for temporarily. This also is a grievous evil. Exactly as man is born, thus he will die. So what is the advantage to him who toils for the wind? Throughout his life, he also eats in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. And ultimately here, Solomon is saying, you can pursue these things, but understand where it leads. It's a pretty miserable existence. Once again, Solomon speaking from experience. He says, you'll find yourself eating in darkness, though you have everything. Eating in darkness with great vexation, sickness, and anger. And now from here, you get one of these glimpses behind the curtains that only God can give eternal purpose and joy to life. This third observation in verses 18 through 20. Here's what I've seen to be good and fitting, to eat, to drink, and enjoy oneself in all his labor in which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. This is his reward. So he said this a few times now. He says, so what's the point of life? He says, I just hope you can enjoy your work and you can eat and sleep and enjoy your time, your years. And you get this idea that Solomon, in all of his attempts to live apart from God, you look at the history of his life, later in life, he often went away from God in his ways. And you get a very clear picture of misery. And yet here he says, but there's one thing that's good in this life if you can find it. Eat, drink, and enjoy oneself in all the labor which he toils under the sun during the few years of his life which God has given him. He says, understand each day matters. Enjoy each day, for this is his reward from God. So he turns his attention back to this idea that God is the giver of the gift of joy and pleasure and fulfillment and purpose. He says, and furthermore, in verse 19, as for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, he has also empowered him to eat from them and to receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. This is the gift of God. So notice the difference here. He talked about pursuing wealth, and it will not satisfy, and he says, and it's misery. But if you understand this as a gift from God, what's the response of the heart? Receive his reward and rejoice in his labor. So there's an avenue that's misery and pain and difficulty as we pursue to grow a bigger mountain for ourselves of wealth. Or there's a life where we understand this rightly and we can find joy in each day because we understand every dollar, every euro we make, every dime we save is God's for his glory and his kingdom, to be used by him. And then he says an interesting phrase in verse 20. For he will not often consider the years of his life, because God keeps him occupied with the gladness of his heart. Talks about the toil of each day, the difficulty of each day. He says, but when we actually begin to understand the joy and pleasure of life that God gives us, it's a gift of each day. He says the years will begin to fly by. And we may find ourselves sometimes doing that. We live in a world that we keep ourselves busy with so many things, and we may say, oh, wow, that was 5 years ago. But he carries with it this idea that as we begin to recognize who God is and how he works in our lives, we begin to find purpose, value, and joy, to the point that each day is not toil and difficulty, but each day is pleasure and rejoicing in him, to the point that time seems to fly by. Julia turned 6 in July. Seems like just yesterday she was born. Time often feels like a thief. It's here today, and next day you open your eyes and 5 years have passed. But let's understand the categories that Solomon is creating here. He says you can understand that money will not satisfy. You can pursue that, but you will be miserable in the process. Or you can understand that God can truly satisfy you eternally. Find worth and value in your lives each and every day. And then he comes back to wealth again now in chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, and we see you can have everything and still have nothing. You can have everything and still have nothing at the same time. And by that, what I mean when I say that is you can have every bit of wealth, you can have everything the world has to offer, and you can still be spiritually bankrupt. You can still not have a relationship with God. And here he categorizes it in 3 ways, and I'll try to go through this as quickly as possible. He goes through 3 areas of that the world in this day would have counted as blessing. Money, children, and long life. It says, there's an evil which I've seen under the sun, and it is prevalent among men. A man to whom God has given riches and wealth and honor, so that his soul lacks nothing of all that he desires. Yet God has not empowered him to eat from them, for a foreigner enjoys them. This is vanity and a severe affliction. So he says, blessing 1. In the Old Testament times, they would have viewed the multiple areas of blessing, and wealth was one of the greatest areas. If you're wealthy, then God must have blessed you. And he says, but you can have all the wealth, and he says, you never know what will happen. A bad investment, a war, a conquering king comes in, and you lose it all. He says, wow, that is vanity, that is meaningless, and a severe affliction. And now he goes to a second blessing. If a man fathers 100 children and lives many years, however many they be, but his soul is not satisfied with good things, and he does not even have a proper burial, then I say, better is the miscarriage than he. Now referencing a miscarriage, for it comes in futility, and it goes into obscurity, and its name is covered in obscurity. It never sees the sun, and it never knows anything. It is better off than he. So the second blessing here is children. He talks about, in their day, they would have said, someone with children is the most blessed. And he says, even if you had hundreds of children. He says, it's not ultimately the answer. And he says, and living a life apart from God, he says, ultimately, it's better that you were never born. He uses the image of a stillborn child. That is a gruesome and difficult image for us to understand. And for anyone, if you've ever gone through that, you know the difficulty and the pain of a moment like that. Solomon uses this image here of a stillborn child, and he says, a life lived, though he may have 100 children, though he may have everything he would want. He says if it's apart from God, he says it's better that he had never lived at all. He says, but his soul is not satisfied with the good things, and he does not even have a proper burial. He says ultimately the 100 kids may not even care for him when it's all said and done. He says because he did not understand the point of it all. the purpose of it all. I want us to understand what Solomon's doing here is he's going through these areas that their culture in the day would have said, this is what a blessed person lives like and has. And Solomon says, yet without God, even those blessings can feel like curses. And then thirdly here he says, even if the other man lives 1,000 years twice and does not enjoy good things, do not all go to one place. So his final focus here, he says in this third blessing that the culture would have celebrated is a long life. He says, even if you lived 1,000 years twice, you do it apart from God, what is the advantage of it? You do not live with the joy of the Lord, learning to enjoy the good things God has given us. He says, ultimately, what happens when we die? Do not all go to the same place. And understand, this is a bit of a heavy passage. This is a heavy book, but it's important for us. I love that Solomon, he pulls out real life for us. To place it in front of us to say, these are your options. How will you live? Will you submit to Christ in his ways, or will you pursue worldly things? What is your focus? Who or what? And so, he goes through these three items: riches, children, and a long life. And ultimately, he's saying here, you can have all of those things that are great and still lack meaning in life if you do it apart from God. Which should send us back to verses 18 and 20, where he says, only if we understand the gift of God, only if we understand the gift of God, the gift of life, then we're sent back to these things such as wealth and children and a long life, that we understand those are things to be used by God for his glory and his kingdom. And suddenly those things have purpose, but without God, Solomon's saying, what's the point? What's the point of it all? And so our final observation I'll make here is, without God, everyone suffers the same fate. This is in verses 7 through 9. All a man's labor is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not satisfied. He says, what do we work for? We work to eat. And yet we get hungry again. I mean, what a beautiful picture of the cycle of life. We work to buy food, to eat. We get hungry again. We work to buy food, to eat, and we get hungry again. And all through the study of Ecclesiastes, I think back to Jesus and his interaction with the woman at the well. If you knew who was asking you for water, you would ask me for water, is what Jesus said to the woman. For I bring living water, through whom you'll never thirst again. So he's pointing out a worldly satisfaction here, where he says, your appetite will never be quenched. But in God, you can find eternal satisfaction. So all a man's labor is for his mouth, and yet the appetite is not satisfied. For what advantage does the wise man have over the fool? What advantage does the poor man have knowing how to walk before the living? What the eye see is better than what the soul desires. This too is futility and a striving after the wind. So here now, he draws attention to the wise man and the poor man. He says, the wise man in all of his wisdom, if he does it apart from God, what's it matter when he dies? The poor man, however he may live, however he may walk amongst the world, what matters when he dies? He says they all go to the same place. And so we must look at this. He's understanding this dimly, looking forward to the promises of God. We look at this from this side of the cross, where we understand that Christ came to die for sinners like you and me. Ultimately, we look at this section of the passage and understand, apart from God, it doesn't matter how much we have or how little we have, we're on a path to destruction, eternal separation from God. But if we're a follower of Jesus, it's interesting. It doesn't matter how much we have or how little we have on this earth. We're on a path to eternity with Christ. This is ultimately the picture he paints, though it's dimly painted as he looks forward to the promises of God being fulfilled, that we know were fulfilled in Christ Jesus. And he says an interesting thing in verse 9. He says, what the eyes see is better than what the soul desires. This too is futility and striving after wind. He says, look around. Watch the world. See what's happening. It happens over and over and over again. We keep making the same mistakes and expecting different results. What the eyes see is better than what the soul desires. Because ultimately he's saying, you may say, oh, I can do a little more, and then that'll provide satisfaction. Understand, he's continually talking here about a life apart from God. You may seek to find satisfaction through all your stuff and all your efforts and all your labors. He says, look around. It's not the answer. And understand what our soul is actually craving is a relationship with the living God. So, I want to leave us well over on my time. I want to leave us with 4 application questions today for us to consider, and then we will discuss on Tuesday in our Bible study, where we'll look at this passage in more depth. But 4 questions for us today. How do you try to find satisfaction in worldly treasures? You may say, no, not me. Consider your heart in this area. How do you try to find satisfaction in worldly treasures? Second question, how does a relationship with Jesus give eternal satisfaction? So we can try to find satisfaction in anything other than Jesus, but understand that it's only in Jesus that we can find eternal satisfaction. I just want to mention, I don't know who's watching online and everyone that's here. If you don't know who this Jesus is and you're interested in hearing more, talk with any of us. You may say, I find no hope in this world. I find no meaning in this world. We believe as Christians that Jesus provides eternal hope for the world. If you're interested in hearing more about what that means, please talk with any of us. The third question here, as we think about applying this to our lives, do you realize you can have every worldly treasure and still be spiritually bankrupt? Do you realize you can have it all and still have nothing? And the final question, how do you seek to rightly view money as a gift from God rather than as an idol competing with God? How do we seek to understand these things rightly?